on the face of it, what we're seeing here is fairly simple. It's an adapted ultralight aircraft. I believe it's a A-22 Foxbat. Um, Essentially, a cheap and cheerful private propeller plane, which has been adapted for use as a one-way attack UAV. So much as the sort of purpose-designed Iranian Shahed 136s are a sort of standard component of Russia's air campaign against Ukraine, Ukraine has been developing a range of one-way attack UAVs, from quite small systems to things clearly that are adapted from ultralight aircraft, which for one-way attack UAVs are on the sort of larger end of things. The basic relationship between range and therefore reach against targets at distance and size is that the larger something is, the more fuel it can carry and the more payload in terms of warhead you can pack in for a given level of performance, if that makes sense. You're always going to be trading off weight that you can carry and fuel with performance. So if you want something to go hundreds of kilometers at quite high speeds, it's going to have to be jet powered, and that will give you a fuel burn that means you're going to end up with something about the size of a cruise missile at minimum. If you want something that is much smaller that will go the same distance, you'll typically have to accept a much slower speed, which means that you're dealing with a lot less drag and you're having to put in a lot less power for any given kind of time period. That means you'll have a lot slower transit, of course, but that is why most of these kind of one-way attack systems that are designed to be relatively cheap and used in large numbers are propeller-powered, slow, and therefore can cover significant distance, even though some of them are quite small. So the Shahed 136 is about 200 kilograms. It's not tiny, but compared to an aircraft, it's pretty small. That can go more than 1,000 kilometers. Clearly, in this case, the Ukrainians have taken an ultralight aeroplane, which typically you might expect to be able to fly for maybe 3-4 hours. That would be with an hour of fuel margin if you were flying it as a light aeroplane, because you have to have a fuel margin. Obviously, for a one-way attack system, that's not a concern. And they've put what looks like a probably 20 to 30 kilogram warhead in there in terms of the blast, probably closer to 30. In some ways, these systems are very simple, but in the sense that they just need to fly to a given point, probably using GPS or GLONASS, the Russian equivalent, and then go into the ground at that point. On the other hand, the kind of considerations around when they work and how they work in terms of their effectiveness are really quite complicated, because for a start, flying slowly may actually help in some cases to get past older air defense systems, because radars use what are called Doppler gates to try and filter out, because a radar is sending out to try and detect air threats. A radar is sending out energy and essentially receiving back all of the echoes from that energy bouncing off things. Radars don't want to have to display, you don't want your radar to have to display, the ground, trees, birds, clouds, depending on the frequencies that you're using. They might reflect as well. And so essentially most radars for air defense work or for fighter aircraft will use Doppler to basically filter out all the returns that don't exhibit a shift over time from something moving at a given speed. So if something's moving either fast towards you or fast away from you, there will be a Doppler shift evident in the returns. And so most radars will simply drop things. In other words, they won't display, they won't track things that sit outside a given speed range. So if it's an air defense radar, you might have the radar designed to pick up anything between about 100 miles an hour and 1,500, let's say. And if it's a ballistic missile radar, you'd probably go even faster, or would go even faster. So if you're dealing with really slow flying things, unless operators know that there is a slow flying threat that they need to potentially be concerned about, the radar may simply filter it out as kind of background clutter and therefore not display. So in some cases, slow aircraft actually or slow UAVs are actually more difficult to defend against. It is possible, particularly with modern radars with a lot more digital control over the signal and the processing of it, to have really much wider Doppler gates. And so most Russian systems, in terms of the most up-to-date stuff, are actually able to track these things, at least most of the time. But even then, you typically still have to be widening the Doppler gates more than you'd like in terms of making sure you've got that coverage. And what that will mean is that there will be a lot more clutter and a lot more kind of junk returns than operators would like, because they're having to cover for things that are moving pretty slowly, and therefore they're getting a lot of returns from other things in the environment. There's also, of course, the case of electronic warfare. So both sides in Ukraine, but particularly Russia, use electronic warfare extensively. The most common being simply the jamming of GPS signals. So if you are flying a UAV and it navigates using GPS, which a lot of commercial UAVs and a lot of the commercial GPS software and chips which are used to adapt whatever it might be, UAVs, light aircraft, etc., for these military purposes, will simply not function if GPS jamming equipment is being used around them. You can play around with a sort of a mix of an inertial navigation system, which basically measures or tries to measure distance and speed and heading over time. As long as you know where you were when you started, then you can kind of, with increasing errors over time, you can navigate with an automatic system. Now, that might enable you to get through an area where there's quite a lot of GPS jamming. And then hopefully once you're past the area where GPS is being jammed, as long as the error that's accumulated is not too big, then the system may be able to then pick up a GPS signal again and thereby correct its position. So there are ways to navigate through the EW, but it's again a huge constraint on where and how ubiquitously these sort of UAVs, from the very small up to the rather larger like this, can be used. In some ways, striking target in the really deep areas is perhaps easier, because this was not one of Russia's key, for example, bases. And so this far inside Russia, it's unlikely there'd be much in the way of air defense systems there. There's a finite number of SAM systems that Russia has and operators and capacity, so they can't defend everything. And it's far enough back that the costs of imposing GPS jamming, for example, in that part of Russia were probably assessed as higher than the benefit likely to be gained from any protection, because they didn't think it would come under attack. So yeah, these Ukrainian long-range UAVs are something that Russia is going to struggle to completely defend against, because you can't put air defense everywhere, you can't put EW effects everywhere, and certainly not all the time. But at the same time, it's probably important not to overstate how effective these things can be. They impose damage, they impose cost, but they're not going to have strategically decisive effects. If you look at Ukraine itself, Ukraine has taken about 8,500 missile and one-way attack UAV strikes over the last 2 years. Ukraine is a significantly smaller country than Russia. It was a significantly less resilient in terms of the pre-war state country than Russia can be. And so, given that Ukraine is still fighting and, of course, has taken huge damage, but is still able to continue the war, we probably shouldn't overstate how much attacks on secondary targets that are not as worth defending in the depth of Russia that cause inconvenience, how much effect that's actually going to have on the overall war. But, we've also seen the Ukrainians use these systems against arguably more important targets. So, for example, attacks over the last week against a number of Russian Air Force bases, including one of their primary bases for their Sukhoi 34, which is the primary attack jet, which reportedly caused some losses. There you would have to use, there would be air defenses. And so rather than having kind of adapted things like this light aircraft attack, where you're just getting a long-range thing with a clever navigation solution to a distant, not particularly defended target, because they can't defend everything. If you're going after things like air bases, you have to use a large number of weapons and rely on essentially suppression of the defenses through saturating their capacity. They can't engage all of them coming in at the same time, because either they're coming in from multiple directions or there are just enough of them that the SAM systems in place run out of ready-to-fire interceptors and have to reload, which will take a while. So Uh, there, the systems may be cheap, but you have to use a really large number of them in order to have the effect, because you need to get through defenses. And in that sort of complex attack, you're much more dependent on what the electronic warfare environment is as well, and what your seekers are. Because if the Russians know that they're under attack by a really large wave of UAVs, it's really worth their while jamming as much of the spectrum as they can for the period that the attack is underway, even though it might degrade their own capabilities and potentially expose the location of EW systems. Um, I guess in summary, the more the use of UAVs in general, in sort of large scale use of cheap adapted UAV technology, can present a lot of novel problems for militaries. And if militaries don't have any defensive capabilities, they can be hugely damaging. But the more you rely on them as a core part of your military effect, your sort of toolbox, if you like, the more worth the enemy's while it is to develop and to use countermeasures at scale against them. And if the physics problem essentially that you're presenting the enemy with is how do I deal with lots of small UAVs, and that's one of their main problem sets, that's actually not a hugely difficult one to do. So the development of counter UAV technologies is probably going to increase dramatically following, well, as the war goes on and following the experiences of the war. If you compare that as a challenge to, for example, ballistic missile defense, where you're trying to hit an incoming thing moving at several thousand miles an hour with an incredibly tight window, with angles that are extremely difficult to predict ahead of time, with another rocket that physically smashes into it, that as a physics problem is massively more difficult than defending against small UAVs. The reason they're problematic and seen as so difficult by a lot of Western militaries is they're a threat that we haven't really focused enough attention on over the past couple of decades. And so we don't have, for example, ubiquitous short-range air defense systems in most of our Western military formations. That will change, I suspect, but yeah, it's a problem set we haven't looked at for a while.